Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining me for these next few moments. I'd like to begin with a question. Does science expand your faith or empty your faith? The purpose of this video is to help you answer that question. There might already be an answer in your mind, and that's okay. Or you're watching this video and you're wondering, how would I answer that question? Well, I hope that you can answer that question by the time we're done. That's my purpose, that's my plan, that's my hope. Again, welcome. This is episode 1 of a series that I've entitled Suffering Beyond Belief. Jesus Christ. He lived 2,000 some years ago. We know that he was crucified, or at least that's what we've always heard. We know that he wore a crown of thorns. He was whipped or scourged. What does that mean? What did those things entail? What did that really do to his body? This is not a theological video. This is not a political video. This is an informative video on the physical suffering of Jesus Christ. Journey with me as we go back to the Garden of Gethsemane 2,000 years ago, where all of this began. Gethsemane was located just outside of the city of Jerusalem. Jesus and his disciples had just finished the Last Supper, and so they're going out now to the garden, and Jesus wants to pray. It was here that the physical suffering began for him. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the 4 Gospels, and so throughout these videos I'll be reading snippets and kind of sharing verses that will give us the direction or the timeline of all of these things. And so Luke, being a doctor, records a specific little event that the other 3 didn't record. Either they didn't see it or they just maybe overlooked it. So Jesus is praying to the Father. The disciples are not far off. He's asking if there's another way. He's asking if there's a different plan. But ultimately Jesus says, okay, I'll follow you, God. I will do what you're asking me to do. Verse 44 of chapter 22 in Luke says, "And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like great drops of blood falling to the ground." Perhaps you've heard of this. Sweaty blood? Blood mixed with sweat? Was this an actual thing, an infirmity, or a disease? Yes, in fact. And it has a name. Hematidrosis is what it's called. Again, Luke, being a doctor, also an eyewitness of Jesus, his attention to detail gives us this little insight. This is not some literary device or metaphor just to capture the reader. It is an observation that he made. He records it for us. Well, today we have the technology and the knowledge to understand what hematidrosis is and what it meant for Jesus. The sweat gland lies just beneath the outer layer of skin. And so we have the epidermis. That's the layer that we can see. That's the topmost layer. Under that we have the dermis. And we have millions, perhaps trillions, billions of sweat glands all over our body. This is not a surprise. Epidermis, dermis. Down here we've got sweat glands with the pores coming up like this. You may be interested to note that in the epidermis, this top layer, there's no blood vessels. So it's avascular. There's no blood in those top couple layers of the epidermis. All the blood then is from the dermis down below. So sometimes you get those little paper cuts and they don't bleed. Well, there's still nerves there. They still hurt, but that's why there's no blood, because the epidermis doesn't have any blood vessels. The blood vessels, in fact, lie in the epidermis. I'll show in red here. And they go through, and these little capillaries are the smallest in diameter blood vessels. They go and they are intertwined. So if you've got a ball of twine all kind of jumbled together, think of then a red wire that goes through, and it is in and around and over and through these blood vessels. So you've got something like this all over your whole body. Okay? That is where the hematidrosis actually takes place, in those sweat glands. But before we get to the what and the how, I want to address why Jesus had this issue, what was happening to him to make him bleed sweat. Back in verse 44 of Luke, it says, being in anguish. Other translations use the word agony. Think of pain, mental pain, engaged in mental battle with something. He's trying to wrestle with something. He's trying to figure something out or do something. He knew what was in store for his life. He knew that God needed and desired a perfect lamb to be the sacrifice for the iniquity of the people. See, the Old Testament is filled with this idea of sin and sacrifice. That was all about to change. And Jesus knew his role in the whole thing. He would be the sacrifice. His death would pay the debt that could not be paid otherwise. He needed to be crucified in order for God's plan of redemption to work. He was going to die. And that caused him anguish. That was the reason he was in such mental agony, because he knew that he was going to die. That's why Jesus suffered from hematidrosis. That's why. A little bit more on the how and the what. Our bodies, you see, have this built-in mechanism called fight or flight. You ever get goosebumps? Maybe the hair on your neck stands up on end when you're cold, maybe when you're fearful, or something is wrong, you can sense something. Well, in times of great stress or fear or intense mental contemplation, our bodies automatically enter into a state of fight or flight. Mark 14 records this. So again, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Mark being the second of the two. Let me read a couple verses here. In chapter 14, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. Again, that's where that mental anguish starts. He says to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He said to them, "Stay here, keep watch." He was telling them, pray, because there's stuff going on, pray. Going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible the hour might pass from him. He comes back, they're sleeping. Not a good day for the disciples. So, in this situation, this great intensity, this fear, this anxiety, adrenaline is produced, pumped into our bodies. This causes our blood vessels to constrict, increasing our heart rate. Our blood pressure goes up. Blood then is diverted away from the skin, from non-essential brain function, and also non-essential organs, giving us maybe a white or an ashen color. The blood then is transferred into the muscles, giving greater strength and greater speed for a time. Our perception is sharpened beyond normal limits. This was going on for a couple of hours as we read in the Gospels. Well, once Jesus decides that he's going to do what God is asking him to do, the fight or flight mechanism begins to shut down. His body then begins to return to normal. The adrenaline is then pulled from his system. His blood vessels loosen up. Normal color returns to his face and skin as the blood comes back. But due to the extreme nature and the agony and anguish, some of those blood vessels burst in the sweat glands because of the pressure. Okay, our sweat glands here, these capillaries, because of this intensity, they explode or they get too big. Blood mixes with sweat, and when that sweat then leaves through the pores onto the skin, it has an unmistakable color of blood, red. And so now you see why Jesus had this condition of hematidrosis. You add in the what and the how, and you get the whole picture. The physical suffering of Jesus started here in the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, I would add as a side note that his mental suffering began just as much here as the physical suffering did. I look forward to seeing you in episode 2. Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, he hints at the suffering that is to come. In fact, let me read you one verse as I close this video. From Matthew 27, verse 29 says, "And they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand and knelt down before him to mock him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews.'" Again, thank you, and we'll see you next time.